Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has arrived at the White House for crucial talks with U.S. President Donald Trump. The goal of the meeting is to try and find a way to end Moscow's three-year war against Ukraine. It follows Donald Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska last week. Zelenskyy has been accompanied by a host of European leaders who've traveled to Washington to express their solidarity with Ukraine. Well, ahead of the bilateral meeting, Trump was asked whether today's round of talks marked the end of the road for U.S. support for Ukraine. Deal or no deal?
I can never say that. It's never the end of the road. People are being killed, and we want to stop that. So I would not say it's the end of the road. No, I think we have a good chance of doing it. It's been almost 4 years now that a lot of people were killed last week. A lot of people last week. I mean, millions of people killed, but a lot of people last week, for whatever reason, a big number, a lot of soldiers, on both sides. And I know the president, I know myself, and I believe Vladimir Putin wants to see it ended.
For more, we can now cross over to Ines Pohl, DW's Washington Bureau Chief. Ines, all eyes on the Oval Office once more today. The public part of Trump's meeting with Zelenskyy just ended. How was the mood this time around?
Well, it was very different from last time I was here as well, when it ended in a huge disaster. Of course, Volodymyr Zelenskyy basically being kicked out of the Oval Office. That was different this time, at least in the beginning. As you just said, Nicole, this was just like some press remarks and the talks really started after that. So it was friendly. They even joked about Volodymyr Zelenskyy's suit. Last time he was not wearing a suit, and that was kind of the kickoff of this really nasty exchange, which ended him being kicked out of the Oval Office. So that's probably the good news, because everybody was really kind of worried that the kickoff would start bad. But we also, when we look a little bit deeper down what they talked about, have to say everything is still on the table here. Donald Trump did not commit on pushing for a ceasefire. He actually said a ceasefire does not matter to him. He also didn't side neither with Ukraine nor Russia, and blaming Joe Biden, the former president, for this war, which is of course started by Vladimir Putin and not by his predecessor. And that's also crucial here, he tries to put all the pressure on Volodymyr Zelenskyy by saying, if we don't come up with a ceasefire, with some peace deal, the killing will go on. So everything is still open. We really don't know what is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 hours here in Washington.
Zelenskyy did see this coming, so he came with European backup. Even the Secretary General of NATO is there in Washington today. What is their game plan?
He did indeed, and I think everybody was really relieved when we heard that Zelenskyy can bring some Europeans to this meeting, and they indeed showed up in full force. It's like the Chancellor from Germany, Friedrich Merz, the President from France, Emmanuel Macron, it's Ursula von der Leyen, as you said, the boss of the EU, and then we have like the leaders from Finland, from Italy, from Great Britain, of course. They want to show we are standing with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, we are standing with Ukraine, and also kind of support Zelenskyy by not being like bullied down again. But again, the first hour or so, the meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy will be happening without them. Nicole, it's interesting what we heard ahead of this meeting, that the Europeans will be trying to push for a ceasefire, because they are saying if the peace talks go on without a ceasefire, it's not only that the killing goes on, but that also the front line will be moved probably further and further into Ukrainian territory, and that's of course something they want to avoid. So they're here in full force to support the Ukrainian president.
They're in full force, but they're not at the meeting right now between Trump and Zelenskyy. The fact that they're not all meeting at once, what can we read into that, Ines?
Well, obviously, Trump wants to set the tone alone with Zelensky, and some say it's kind of humiliating, actually, that 7 top leaders of the of Europe are sitting next to the Oval Office, literally being locked out as children, in a way. When the adults are talking first, that's definitely something which is not going down well with them. We shall see how the first part of this meeting plays out, and then what the European really can do afterwards. Vladimir Zelenskyy is really in a nearly impossible situation here. All pressure is on him, and his supporters are sitting next door. So yeah, it shows that Trump is just, again, doing what he wants to do, and he wants to show this is my home, this is my place, and if I tell you to wait outside, then it's me who talks first with the president of Ukraine.
That was DW's Washington Bureau Chief Ines Pohl. Thanks. A lot of pressure on the Ukrainian president. Let's talk about that with our correspondent in Kyiv, Nick Connolly. Nick, Trump and Zelensky just spoke to the press. What stood out to you?
I think the body language seemed pretty relaxed. Obviously, this is a very, very difficult situation for Ukraine's president, but he seemed a lot happier than he did back earlier in the year in the Oval Office when we had that big bust-up in February. I think also he was in a suit. I mean, this is as ridiculous as it might sound, but that was one of the things he was criticised for by Trump and his team when he was there last time, that he's in military fatigues. They'd found a kind of compromise now in terms of a kind of black outfit, which is not quite a suit, but not quite a military uniform. I think the most important thing was that, you know, we'd heard from lots of sources that Zelensky's basically been coached by especially the UK on how to deal with Trump, how to formulate his messages in a way that Trump will actually pay attention, how to say things in a kind of short enough way that they won't go past Trump, also to use the kind of Trumpian talking points about stopping the killing. When Trump went kind of off-piste and started talking about voting by post and other things, you saw Zelenskyy kind of suppressing a bit of a smile and having to kind of refocus. But broadly, I think this will be seen as a success. One kind of really characteristic moment was when a reporter tried to get Trump to say once again that Ukraine has none of the cards and basically has to go along with whatever the Russians want. And Trump made a point of not kind of jumping on that and kind of swerving that question.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Zelenskyy did signal he'd be open to a trilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin without a ceasefire agreement in place. Does that surprise you?
It's obviously not the preferred position, but I think it is a fairly small thing to give, right? Compared to agreeing to leave Donetsk region, giving up territory that Ukraine has spent, hundreds, thousands of lives protecting, the ask of kind of turning up at a meeting with Vladimir Putin is comparatively modest. The Ukrainian position had obviously been last week that nothing happens before a ceasefire comes in. But I think Zelenskyy is acutely aware of the kind of potential blame game if things go wrong. So he is not going to basically spend that capital over a meeting. The real kind of hard red line for Ukraine is not giving up territory that it still controls. It's willing to basically freeze the front line as is now, but anything more than that, I think, is basically political suicide for Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
What will Ukrainians be watching for during these talks as they proceed tonight?
Look, we've had such kind of a huge kind of variety of messages coming out over the last few days in terms of what might actually be on the cards, given that there was kind of no clear statement either from Putin nor from Trump in Alaska. So I think it's going to be a lot about the body language, people just watching how does Zelenskyy look with Trump. Does he look like he's basically in a kind of hostage video, or does he look like he has some agency and that he's able to present his positions? And then there's the big question of security guarantees, right? Our colleague Misha Komodowski asked Trump about those, about the kind of reports that maybe the US might even send peacekeepers to Ukraine, something totally new that had just emerged in basically the last 24 hours in a few stories. Trump wouldn't be drawn on that, but I think that is something that really could make a difference and could see Ukraine willing to make more compromises if it gets real kind of boots on the ground in the sense that this would be the end of Russia's aggression here against Ukraine rather than just some vague promises.
That's DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Thank you so much. And DW's chief international editor Richard Walker joins us now. Richard, not a shouting match. That's a step forward. What did you make of this meeting?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the talks now behind closed doors are ongoing, but I think the feeling will be on the Ukrainian side so far so good. As we just heard from Nick, not stepping into any sort of minefields. I think I also recognise what Nick talked about with Zelenskyy kind of picking up some of the kind of Trump-style language or kind of approaches to questions, so when he was asked about, needing weapons supplied by the Americans, he stressed, of course, these are not gifts, they're being paid for by the Europeans. And also, the Americans have some of the best weapons like Patriots and things like this that others cannot produce in this volume. And that, of course, sets Trump rolling about how America has the greatest system. So you can see here and there little sort of traces of that training and coaching that Nick referred to there. Coming through. But, yeah, I mean, in terms of the substance, I mean, there were one or two moments, and I think we have one or two sound bites queued up that could give a little bit of cause for cautious optimism on this area of security guarantees.
Exactly.
Yeah?
If you want to take a look with our viewers at what Volodymyr Zelenskyy said when asked about the need for security guarantees if he were to say yes to a deal put on the table by U.S. President Donald Trump. Let's take a listen.
Everything. And really, it includes two parts. First, strong Ukrainian army. That's what I began to discuss with your colleagues. And it's a lot about weapon and then people and training missions and intelligence. And second, we will discuss with our partners. It depends on the big countries, on the United States, on a lot of our friends.
And Mr. President, are you willing to commit American troops to that NATO-like protection in order to get President Zelenskyy to a deal today?
Well, I don't know if you define it that way, but NATO-like, I mean, we have people waiting in another room right now. They're all here from Europe, biggest people in Europe, and they want to give protection. They feel very strongly about it, and we'll help them out with that. I think it's very important. I think it's very important to get the deal done.
All right. What kind of security guarantees are we looking at here then?
Yeah, so, I mean, he's not being drawn on that, is he? Like NATO-like, as if that came from nowhere, but actually it came from Steve Witkoff, his envoy, who was saying that, it's sort of akin to Article 5, which is that famous kind of part of the NATO treaty, which says that if you attack one, then it's treated like an attack on all. But, I mean, I think the key point that Trump was saying there was like the Europeans are kind of all lined up. They want to kind of provide guarantees and we want to help them out, So... But what does this really mean? I mean, there's a huge range of potential options. Earlier in the year when Trump was coming into office, there was a debate in Europe that kind of went into, okay, could there be some sort of peacekeeping force? And then, the language shifts down to, okay, maybe it's not really peacekeeping because what happens if, a British soldier and a Russian soldier end up in a fight and, are you starting a war with NATO? So then it kind of comes down to maybe a reassurance force, so smaller forces further away from the front line. Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, who was part of this kind of driving this discussion, always said that, this would need a US backstop. So you can't just leave the Europeans on their own dealing with the Russians, that there needs to be maybe air support from the Americans, maybe intelligence support from the Americans. These are all things that are kind of in the realm of discussions. At the very minimum, with security guarantees, it's often talked about what Zelenskyy, we heard him say there the first, give the Ukrainians the kind of army and the kind of equipment that they can stand up for their own security, which, remember, before the war started, the West hardly gave Ukraine any weapons at all. But there we get into the weeds of this. So I've just been looking through, a couple of months after the war began, there was this phase of talks in Istanbul. I don't know if you remember that, where there was this sort of early hopes. Could this be ended diplomatically at an early stage? And the memoranda and the kind of communiques that came out of that did talk about security guarantees, but with huge kind of asterisks and small print. For instance, that you would need a unanimous decision by all of the guarantor states, as they're called, so the various states that would sign up saying, OK, I'm providing a guarantee.
So that coalition
in order to
of the
actually,
willing, as Keir Starmer has been calling it, yeah.
So unanimous decision by them to actually come in, step in and support Ukraine if it did get attacked again. And which are the guarantor states? Well, not just Western countries, but China, Russia, you know? So how are they ever going to agree with, say, Western countries about what would trigger a security guarantee? Yeah. So these are the kind of things that are in the weeds. Also, at that point, you know, the Russians have been saying as recently as a couple of months ago that they want a drastic reduction in the size of the Ukrainian army, not that the West would be able to provide it with lots of weapons. So yeah, we don't, unfortunately, we're still flying a bit too blind about what Putin is really demanding at this stage. And yeah, it could take a while before we really find out the details. But you can expect some pretty difficult details to be.
Yeah, and the Kremlin just came out saying NATO troops in Ukraine, no way at all that we'd agree to a peace deal on these terms. We're talking about concessions on the Ukrainian side a lot, about them giving up territory, even territory that Russia hasn't even captured up to this point. What concessions is Trump demanding or trying to get out of the Russians other than stopping the attacks on Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, none that we've seen so far, none that we have any evidence of. If you look at the public comments by people in Trump's world, Marco Rubio, Steve Witkoff, if they're asked about what concessions are you trying to extract from the Russians, they tend to try and shut it down and say, look, you know, we're in process of talks, we don't want to endanger this diplomacy. But yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why Zelenskyy is so concerned, why you've got all of these European leaders going to Washington today, is that they are very concerned that Trump is kind of allowing or adopting a kind of one-side Putin-esque view of this conflict, and essentially accepting that Putin's concession would be stopping this war. But that would be the only concession. So essentially not completing his total takeover of Ukraine. But in everything else, he's actually requesting, well, it seems more than he has now.
Yeah. What do you make of the constellation of that group that traveled to Washington to support Zelenskyy? Because it's an interesting one, right? There's one or two Trump whisperers.
Yeah. So in terms of Trump whisperers, I mean, in a way, it's a logical constellation because you have... you've got the President of the European Commission, you've got the Secretary General of NATO, so they both represent multiple countries, yeah? And then you have what's called the E3, so that's the French, the Germans and the British. These three countries have been working pretty closely these last few months on this, coordinating very closely. I think Germany has an interesting role there because it's pretty well managed to reset its relationship with Trump in the course of the last few months. Yeah. Trump came in, I mean, I was in D.C. around the time of the election last year, and if you talk to Republicans, they were absolutely full of absolute contempt for Germany as a country that, you know, doesn't pull its weight and just goes around being sanctimonious. Now in Friedrich Merz, I think Donald Trump sees somebody who's a kind of a doer.
Someone he respects.
Someone he respects, is on his wavelength, got a bit of his style. And most of all, he's got a checkbook. Yeah? So Friedrich Merz has now, you know, tweaked the German constitution to enable him to spend very large amounts of money on defense. And it's Merz who's come in, for instance, and said, OK, we'll buy Patriot defense systems for Ukraine. Yeah. We'll pay the checks and you get the business. But yeah, there are one or two other people who are, well, I would pick on Giorgia Meloni, who's ideologically close to Trump as really a kind of conservative nationalist leader in Italy, and Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, who's a good golfer. Yeah, and is also pretty experienced on the international stage, but he's somebody who's certainly got to Trump's heart, as far as we can tell, through games of golf down at Mar-a-Lago, and of course you're going to bring him along, you know. And I think it's pretty much the same lineup that we had last Wednesday when there was a big call between European leaders and Zelenskyy and Trump ahead of the Alaska summit. So they basically kind of got the band back together to come to Washington now, and we see quite a few of them around that table.
Right, and they should meet him at some point today, and we'll have you here to talk all about it. Thank you so much, Richard Walker. Well, while preparations for the summit in Washington were underway, Russia continued its attacks on Ukrainian cities overnight. At least 10 people died in a drone strike on a residential area in Kharkiv. Dozens more were wounded. Other casualties were reported in the southeastern city of Zaporizhia.
Kharkiv is in mourning after a night of deadly strikes on a residential neighborhood, where Ukrainian authorities say Russia fired a missile, followed by a series of drones that struck a 5-story apartment block, reducing entire sections of it to rubble.
We don't know how many people are still under the rubble. There may be more there. The compound was hit multiple times from different sides.
The drone attack, which took place just before dawn, also sparked fires on at least 3 floors. They hit an ordinary apartment block. Many flats, many families were living there. Small children, children's playground, residential compound. There are no offices here or anything else. We lived here peacefully in our homes. Kharkiv, near the Russian border, has been a regular target since Moscow launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022. Officials say the overnight barrage hit far beyond Kharkiv. In Zaporizhia, at least 3 people were killed and 20 wounded. Everything was flying around, even glass. We didn't know where to run. Thank God we're alive and well. Moscow insists it does not target civilians, but Ukraine says the attacks show the opposite. Families buried in rubble and cities living under constant threat.